a second time. The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. As the member for Goldstein, it's a great pleasure to be able to rise to address this bill in its support. But I have to begin, Deputy Speaker, by referring to the speech by the member for Fenner. And I've got to say that in the context of his speech about this bill, it now seems that the phrase "only a Labor government" rolls off so easily from his tongue and with such a predictability and hubris that sometimes you wonder whether he has jumped ahead of himself and the Australian people. Because in the end, every time he gets up and speaks in this place, it is with an absolute confidence and conviction that he believes that he is just the factional apparatchik in waiting to take a ministry in a shortened government. And, of course, he is more than entitled to do so, if he wishes. But he has to actually recognise that this parliament is not over yet. And we are not done yet. But it is a welcome thing to see him get up and speak on this bill, as it is to see the Labor Party is moving in. And at this point, they're not actually moving, as far as I can read on the board, with some sort of superfluous and pointless amendment to justify the extension of this debate and to justify dragging people down simply to vote on the purpose of a failed amendment. They're actually going to let this one go through, which suggests actually that they do think the bill's workable. The bill actually is the foundation of good policy. It's a bill that actually people need to make sure that we can provide the housing finance environment necessary for those Australians that need the assistance in the back of government. And no one should really be surprised, because this government at its heart has the interests of Australians. The Prime Minister said this the day he was sworn into office by the Governor-General, and took upon himself a flag to put on his breast that said, there was an image of the flag, to say that he was on the side of the Australian people. And I know some people on the other side may mock this proposition, Deputy Speaker, but when it comes down to it, they know the truth. They know the truth that this legislation, our legislation, the full program of this government is to deliver for the Australian people. Now, housing is one of those issues, Deputy Speaker, that when it comes down to it, is foundational for our sense of security within society. I often talk about people who wake up, get out of bed, go brush their teeth, get off, dress themselves, go off to work, and be able to invest in their own future off the back of their labour and investment in themselves and their families as the foundation for community and our great nation. But housing is a critical part of that, because if you ever want to see people's lives disrupted, people's lives undermined, it's where they don't have a place simply that they call home. It is the place at which people not just store their, even if sometimes limited possessions that they may have. A home is more than just a place. A home is somewhere where families come together, where people share time with their loved ones, sometimes private time, as well as with friends. It is their island in a world unpredictable. It's also critical for the foundation of every other part of success. It's like the foundation stone of building a life. So having a home is critical, and we all know that, and I think even the opposition, I hope, would acknowledge the critical role of housing. And of course, there's no greater security that can be achieved in life than the capacity to be able to go on and own your own home, to be the custodian of a property, to be able to have the ultimate sense of security. But we know full well that not everybody is in that situation, Deputy Speaker. We know full well that there are millions of Australians who are on their way in life, gone to school, maybe gone to tertiary education, or maybe have gone on straight into the workforce. And they graduate up from living at home to work, and tragically sometimes people can't even fulfil that, to then go on and rent, and then ultimately in the position, if they're able to save, to be able to put themselves to get that ownership and foundation within society. But there are also many people who struggle even to achieve that. And frankly, often it's for factors outside their control. And we as a nation, particularly one as wealthy as ours, cannot turn a blind eye to the plight and suffering of those people and say that we don't have their back, that we don't care about their needs for security too. And it can't always just be overcome with more labour or more work, particularly with the challenges we face in housing affordability on the private market at the moment. And so what this government's done, working with the states and territories, because that's a critical part of it, we of course are often distant capital, the states working directly with people, delivering services, are keen to make sure that every Australian not just has that sense of security, but the foundation for a successful life, and particularly those who are most vulnerable and often the worst capacity or least capacity to be able to correct their situation, which can often be young mothers, young women who may have had children and may no longer have a supportive spouse and are extra needing of the support of this place and the support of their fellow citizens. So National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation is part of that important framework by operating a $1 billion fund under the National Housing Infrastructure Facility. It's a critical part of the overall national approach to addressing the challenges we face in making sure everybody can have their own home. And we know, Deputy Speaker, how critical that is. If you look around the country today, and there's plenty of data out there, what we see is a worrying trend. We see a decline in the rate of private home ownership across almost every single age group across the country. In fact, it's only in the top economic quintile of people over the age of 65 that we see an increase. Every other age group is seeing some form of decline. It's more modest, it's in the 65-plus category, a little greater in the 55-plus category, a little greater again in the 45. But when you get down to home ownership rates amongst people under the age of 35 and 25, I make no apology, I'm concerned about it. Seriously concerned about it. Because home ownership isn't just a place where people live. It is an investment in the status quo. If you want the preservation of a liberal democracy, as I do, a society built on ownership and opportunity, home ownership is critical. Because once people make an investment in the status quo, they have an interest in preserving it. If you're a true Conservative, and I need to make that point, Deputy Speaker, a true Conservative, then you will understand the critical role of housing and how it should be at the fore of the minds of everybody in this place. At the fore of everybody's mind in this place, if we want to preserve the best of the past and take it forward for the future. And I saw this directly, Deputy Speaker, when I was Human Rights Commissioner in my former role, particularly working with Indigenous communities, where, of course, yes, you had people who were displaced from their custom, their culture and their land. And came with that was a legacy of displacement and disruption and continuation of thousands of years of culture and tradition. But when you remove that connection, you also severed that sense of security that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders hold. Now, it is not the same as our modern title of land that we have, where people buy their own home. Yes, it can be on the basis of collective ownership. But the principle that sits behind it and security that people derive from a place they call home, no matter the culture, can never be underestimated. This is what the Chinese Communist Party never understood when they sought to deal with issues around property rights, that people would stand there and fight, even against the tyranny and the oppression of the state that wanted to displace them and move them for some sort of collective ambition. Private property ownership and ownership generally, and having a place called home, is foundational for any society that wants to seek to preserve itself. And part of the enduring challenge that we have in this place, when you look at all of the well-intentioned but failed policies designed to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, is that we are constantly trying to repair the damage that we have done to rebuild the connection to that sense, that cultural understanding of a place called home. And it's no different in practice for so many people who lose their home in our modern society as well. But if we're going to address the challenges around making sure people, no matter what economic stage in life, have access to housing that meets their needs, we must be realists. People cannot just simply turn to the state to provide all of the support and welfare benefits that they wish or may seek. Not only does that suffocate the spirit of entrepreneurialism, but also sacrifice that's necessary to have a society that sustains itself. People should be encouraged to stand on their own 2 feet and to be able to take care of themselves, not out of a selfish ambition, but so they're in the best position to take care of themselves, so they're not a burden on others, so that they can help others stand up too. But a critical part of that is also because then they leave open the space that others need to get support and assistance for other types of social support. When people come to me and speak to me about the challenges around social housing, and I'm not seeking to play it down, it is a serious issue. There are challenges that we need to face to provide the financial instruments, the bond structures for people to be able, or for governments and for the private sector and for community organisations and for civil society organisations to finance a development for new housing for people. But the greatest thing we can do to lessen the burden on the social housing system is to have a private system that works. Because the more people who can take care of themselves, the less people will turn to the social housing system and say we need assistance and support. Free up the places that those less fortunate than ourselves depend upon. And that should be our ambition in our housing policy, to make the private system work and to support those who can't. And that's part of what this bill is trying to address as part of a national strategy. Again, working with the states and the territories, because they are ultimately the service providers. The $1 billion National Housing Infrastructure Facility and its affordable housing bond aggregator can play an enormous good in helping to change the landscape for more available housing, but it is only one part of that story. We need states to step up and meet the expectations and obligations to them. And that's to be able to shift the regulations and the controls so that there is more housing available for different stages of life, in locations where people need to live, and to stop suffocating new development. And that's one of the things I have great concerns about, Deputy Speaker, in our opponent's policy come the next election. We saw modelling data out today looking at the consequences of changing rules around taxing losses, which is what the Labor Party is proposing should they win the next election if people invest in housing. Most people talk about it as negative gearing. It's not. It's putting a tax on losses. Possibly the most ridiculous policy proposal you could ever invent. To tax a loss. And what did the modelling show of the forward projections in terms of housing development? The introduction of this tax on losses will lead to 42,000 less homes developed in Australia. 42,000 families who will be denied the opportunity to secure their own home. 42,000 Australians who will be pushed into the pool of those dependent on existing housing. So 42,000 families who will add the burden on the social housing stock. And why? Because our political opponents don't actually have answers to these pressing problems. Instead, what they are doing is going to tax losses and undermine confidence in housing development, rather than focusing on the sorts of policies that are in this legislation so that we can deliver the housing stock Australians desperately need.
I thank the member for Goldstein.